Welcome to the supplementary video for Chapter 3, Human Relations and Human Resources Approaches to Organizational Communication. As always, start by going through this list of things you should understand as a result of reading the chapter. And it's a great way to study because all the quiz items for each chapter come directly from these lists. Chapter 3 focuses on alternative approaches to organizational communication that emerged in response to key shortcomings of the classical approaches. Despite important insights about managing, organizing, and communicating that arose from the Industrial Revolution, many of which are still critical parts of today's organizational landscape, people recognized several inadequacies of classical approaches that needed to be addressed. In particular, classical approaches don't pay much attention to the individual needs of employees, non-financial rewards, the prevalence of social interaction in organizations, or how employees can contribute to meeting organizational goals through their knowledge, ideas, and discussion. Classical approaches really only valued physical labor. Now, things started to change in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. Researchers from Harvard University embarked on a number of studies at the Western Electric Company's Hawthorne plant in Illinois. These started as normal studies in scientific management, trying to figure out new ways to make the plant more productive and efficient, especially how the work environment affected worker output. But the research team found out something very different and quite unexpected. Although their various interventions into the work environment at the plant, like adjusting the lighting level, didn't have any direct impact on worker productivity, the researchers concluded that one thing did have a positive impact on worker output: the basic fact that researchers were paying attention to them and considering their needs simply by doing these studies in the first place. This led to the conclusion that social and emotional needs of workers are critical factors in worker output, something we now call the Hawthorne Effect. And although the data and analysis of these Hawthorne studies were later called into question, they still had a tremendous impact on management scholars and practitioners, who at least started believing that human needs and social interaction played an important role in organizational functioning, and thus turning away from the mechanistic view of classical approaches. And therefore, the informal organization was discovered, and the human relations movement was born. Make sure you read the sections in the chapter that describe the Hawthorne studies in more detail to get a sense of how the human relations movement developed as a response to the classical approaches we explored in Chapter 2. Now, our textbook highlights two representative theories from the human relations movement: Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and Mcgregor's Theory X and Theory Y. Abraham Maslow was a psychologist who developed a theory of human motivation, famously captured in his Pyramid of 5 Needs. Although this is a general theory of human motivation, Maslow and others applied his theory extensively to organizational behavior. If you've taken an introductory psychology course, you've probably seen this hierarchy of needs, as people move from physiological and safety needs to affiliation and esteem needs, all the way up to the need for self-actualization. For managers and scholars in the human relations movement, this theory serves as a prototype to organizing and managing. Organizations enable workers to meet basic needs so they can achieve higher order needs through their work. Next, Douglas Mcgregor was a management professor at MIT and a strong proponent of the human relations approach. His Theory X and Theory Y represents the divergent assumptions and approaches managers can hold and take about organizational functioning. Theory X is representative of a manager influenced by the most negative aspects of classical management theories, assuming that workers lack ambition and responsibility and need to be managed through discipline and control. In contrast, a Theory Y manager adheres to the basic precepts of the human relations movement, seeing workers as being motivated by higher order needs and capable of independent achievement in the workplace. The job of the manager is then to bring out the natural tendencies of these intelligent and motivated employees. In general, the human relations movement marks a shift in thinking compared to classical approaches. Workers don't just work, they also feel. In this way, it's more appropriate to use a family metaphor to understand organizations, not just a machine metaphor. This is also an important shift for our purposes because communication becomes much more significant in the human relations approach. Communication is no longer just formal commands from management, but also a key aspect of creating and sustaining the informal organization. But some people felt that this shift in emphasis from working to feeling went a bit too far, losing sight of important aspects of organizational productivity. Yes, we need to focus on social and emotional factors in the workplace, but organizations still need to be productive and effective. And that's the focus of the human resources approach that is also featured in this chapter. What the human resources approach adds to the mix is consideration of the cognitive contributions employees make with their thoughts and ideas. Now, there really isn't some sort of definitive moment or watershed event for the human resources approach like the Hawthorne studies for the human relations movement. Instead, throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was growing recognition that overemphasizing worker feelings and emotions could come at the expense of organizational productivity and effectiveness. But this didn't mean a return to classical approaches like scientific management. Instead, the idea of human resources emerged as a way to combine the best of classical approaches, productivity and efficiency, with the best of human relations, consideration of workers' social and emotional needs. One of the most popular and prevalent approaches to management that emerged from the human resources movement was Blake and Mouton's managerial grid. Robert Blake and Jane Mouton were organizational researchers who wanted to develop a management training tool that would enhance organizational efficiency and effectiveness, scientific management, and stimulate the satisfaction and creativity of individual workers, human relations. Their managerial grid, now usually referred to as the leadership grid, charts different management styles on two main areas: concern for people and concern for production. Some managers are really focused on production, but not very good with working with people. Others are really good at working with people, but not great at production. And as you can see in their managerial grid, they name the different kinds of managers at the extremes of each area, with team management the ideal because it has both high concern for people and high concern for production, the epitome of the human resources approach. You can skip over some of the other stuff in this chapter and jump right to this chart that compares how communication is conceptualized in classical, human relations, and human resources approaches. Also pay attention to the sections that discuss human relations and human resources in today's organizations, especially since you are likely to work for an organization that has a specific human resources department. Who knows? You might even work for the human resources department, a great career for communication majors. And look over these questions at the end of the chapter. Good stuff to think about as you consider your discussion board participation this week. Next up in Chapter 4, we'll move on to systems and cultural approaches to organizational communication. Probably two of the most dominant approaches that shape the organizational theory and practice landscape today.